Have you ever believed a promise? Not because it was certain, but because you had nowhere else to go. That morning, in the town of Dusthaven, a horse-drawn carriage stopped in the middle of the dusty government street. No trumpet sounded. No one was waiting. Only the dry sound of hooves and the wind rustling through the old wooden signs could be heard. A middle-aged woman stepped down. Her name is Clara Hayes. Her face bore bruises that hadn't yet faded. Her dress was frayed at the hem, hastily patched. In her hand she carried only a small cloth bag, so light it was almost empty. She went to the west to pursue a promise, and she arrived carrying with her the price of having believed. No one came forward to call her name. No one came forward, not a question, not a nod. Only glances, scrutinizing, cold, frighteningly familiar. In Dusthaven, one thing was immediately apparent: a woman standing alone. Can you imagine that feeling? After so many miles, so many handwritten letters, so many solemn promises, you finally stand in a strange place and realize that your trust is no longer worth exchanging. Clara stood there in the middle of the main street as if the whole town were waiting for her to realize one thing. Here there is no place for those who come empty-handed, and even less so for those who have been hurt. If it were you, would you turn away, or would you stand still and accept whatever happens next? This is not a miracle story. This is the story of a woman who came to the West with all she had, left her faith which had been lost. If you want to know what Clara Hayes will have to choose, stay with us. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue the story of You're Coming With Me. The Cowboy Who Took In a Bruised Male. Order Bride. The carriage drove away without looking back. Dust rose, then settled, and Clara Hayes stood there as if she had just been left at the edge of her own life. Dusthaven in the morning looked more peaceful than it actually was. The wood shops were half closed. The pub was silent, the smell of decay lingering in the air. At the end of the street, the police station, with its iron star hanging askew, was deserted, with no one to greet or ask questions. Clara clutched the strap of her bag tightly. She didn't cry. Not because she didn't hurt, but because she had used up all her tears on the long journey from the east to here. Every bruise on her body was an answer to what had happened, but in Dusthaven people don't ask the story. They only look at the results. She remembered the letters very clearly. The neat handwriting. The firm promises of a home, a decent marriage, a new beginning in the border region. The man didn't come. Nobody came. A gust of wind swept across the main street, whipping up the hem of her torn dress. Clara turned away, as if trying to avoid her own reflection in the grocery store window. She looked older than her age, not because of the years, but because she had been forced to believe too many times. In Dusthaven, women don't stand alone for very long. Clara sensed this instinctively. The gazes lingered longer than politely. They were scrutinizing, not curious, but judgmental. She wondered, how many options do I have left? In her purse, she knew exactly what she had. No need to open it. 62 cents. A broken comb. And the old letters that had served their final purpose, bringing her here, and then abandoning her. Clara slowed her pace a few more steps, then stopped in the middle of the street. Not because she didn't know where to go, but because she understood that from this moment on, every step was a life or death decision. Dusthaven didn't offer a welcoming hand. It just stood there waiting to see if she would fall, or if she would learn to stand firm with nothing left. And that's when this story really begins. Dusthaven isn't a menacing town at first glance. It doesn't yell, threaten, or display aggression impulsively. On the contrary, Dusthaven has the familiar look of hundreds of other border towns. A short main street, a few old timber shops, and the feeling that it has existed long enough to learn to no longer be surprised by the suffering of others. The pub sat on the corner, its door slightly ajar despite the early hour. Inside, the stale smell of liquor and cigarette smoke mingled as if the night had never truly ended. Several men sat leaning against the counter, speaking softly, but their eyes constantly darting outside. Dusthaven had a habit of observing before speaking. The grocery store was across from the pub. Bags of flour, sugar, and dried beans were neatly stacked behind the frosted glass window. Inside, the shopkeeper glanced at Clara Hayes only once, enough to acknowledge her presence, then bent down and continued his work. No malice. No interest. In Dusthaven, indifference was a way of conserving energy. At the end of the street was the police station. The doors were closed. The iron star hanging on the outer wall had darkened with age. There were no footsteps, no sign of security. The law in Dusthaven existed as a decoration enough to remind us that it once had meaning. Clara walked slowly down the street. She wasn't looking for help. She was just trying to understand how this place worked. It was the instinct of those who had been hurt: observe, first believe later if they could still believe. She felt eyes following her, not from one person but from many directions. Not intense, not aggressive, just quiet, assessing glances, as if Dusthaven were wondering, to whom does this woman belong? The three men stepped out from the shadows of the pub. They weren't in a hurry. There was no need to rush. Leading the way was Harlan, tall, with prematurely graying hair, a perpetual smile that never reached his eyes. Following him was Cole, shorter, broad-shouldered, his gait heavy as if accustomed to occupying space. Last was Vic, younger than the other two, his shifty eyes constantly scanning the surroundings as if searching for something he could exploit. They approached Clara, not like predators pouncing on their prey. They approached like men confident that their prey had nowhere to go. "Hello, ma'am," Harlan said first, his voice just loud enough to be heard but soft enough not to attract attention. "You're new here, aren't you?" Clara stopped. She didn't back away, nor did she move forward. She simply turned to face them. "Yes. Dusthaven isn't an easy place to live," Cole said, his voice low, like a warning disguised as advice. "Especially for women traveling alone." Vic chuckled softly, as if that statement were such an obvious truth that it needed no further explanation. Harlan tilted his head, his gaze sweeping quickly across Clara's bruised face, then lingering just long enough for her to realize he had seen it all. "We just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said. "It's better to have someone watching over you here." Clara understood immediately. No explanation was needed. Dusthaven's language lay not in the words themselves, but in the implied meaning. "Keep an eye on things," Clara repeated, her voice surprisingly calm even to herself. "And what in return?" Cole shrugged. "Nothing's free in the West." Vic took another half step forward, then stopped when he met Clara's gaze. "We know where to stay," he said. "And jobs, too. The kind of things women like you usually need." Women like her. Women like her. Clara heard every word clearly. And in that moment she understood what Dusthaven had wanted to teach her since the carriage left. A woman without a man behind her. In this case, not a person, was an opportunity. "Do you have family here?" Harlan asked, his voice as soft as a breeze. "No," Clara replied. "Husband?" Cole asked again. "Are not." A silence fell, not long, but enough for the three men to exchange glances. No words were needed. They had the answer. Harlan let out a sigh, as if taking on the responsibility for the entire town. "Well, ma'am," he said slowly, "in Dusthaven, protection is a form of currency." Clara felt that the remark wasn't directed at her, but at everyone who had ever held that position before. It had been used so many times, enough to become an unwritten rule. "And what if I have nothing to pay with?" Clara asked. Cole looked at her, his eyes no longer feigning kindness. "Then you'll have to accept what you might get." No one touched her. No one raised their voice. But Clara felt the air around her close, like a windowless room. She realized that the danger in Dusthaven lay not in violence, but in the composure of those who believed they had the power to decide the fate of others. Clara looked at each person individually. She saw no hatred, only a system that had operated for too long without being challenged. A town accustomed to sustaining itself on the weaknesses of others. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'll manage on my own." Vic smirked. Cole shook his head. Harlan maintained his usual smile, but his eyes had turned cold. "As you wish," Harlan said. "But Dusthaven won't wait long for anyone to learn their lesson." They turned away as slowly as they had arrived. No threats. No surveillance. They knew she was still there. And Dusthaven hadn't disappeared. Clara stood alone. The street hadn't changed. The pub was a little noisier than before. The grocery store was quiet. The police station was still closed. But inside her something was clearer than ever. This isn't just a place she's late for. This is a place that will test how long she can endure. And as Clara Hayes took a deep breath and continued down the street, she didn't know that very soon Dusthaven would encounter a man who wouldn't accept the way this town lived. Because when a society pushes people to the point of having no choice, the next choice, however small, can change everything. As dusk falls over Dusthaven, the town doesn't become any more dangerous, it just becomes more real. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the main street, revealing cracks in the wooden surfaces and faded signs. Clara Hayes walked slowly, as if each step required her permission. She was no longer searching for an escape. She was trying to define the final boundary, the point where a person must decide who they still are. No one followed her, but she knew she wasn't alone. Dusthaven had its own way of surrounding her without getting too close. The glances from the pub, the quick stares from the shops, the heavy silence from the police station, all of it combined to form an unspoken question. What would she choose? Clara stopped in front of a low building with thick curtains covering the windows. No sign was needed. In towns like Dusthaven, there was no need to specify the function of such places. Everyone knew, and everyone pretended not to know. "You can find a place to sleep tonight," Harlan's voice rang out from behind her. Clara didn't turn back immediately. She had anticipated this, not because she was weak, but because she understood the rules of places like Dusthaven. When someone is pushed to the brink, society offers solutions all seemingly reasonable, until one looks closely at the price to be paid. Harlan, Cole, and Vic stood a few steps away from her. The distance was polite enough, safe enough. No one touched her. No one raised their voice. But there was a chilling certainty in the air, as if the outcome had been predetermined. "We're not forcing anyone," Harlan said, his voice low and even. "Just giving them a choice." Clara turned around. "A choice?" Cole nodded, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "There's a place for her to work. A brothel. Not everyone's a good fit, but many people make a living there." Vic continued faster, as if afraid silence would make things even more embarrassing. "Or she could serve privately. Fewer people would know. Less trouble." Clara listened to every word. She didn't tremble, not because she wasn't afraid, but because the fear had moved beyond outward expression. It lay deep inside, like a stone blocking her chest. "And what if I refuse?" she asked. Harlan sighed, like someone tired of explaining the obvious. "Then, you take care of it yourself." Needless to say, Dusthaven doesn't need to threaten death. It just needs not to help you live. Clara bowed her head, her hands clutching the small cloth bag tightly. She felt the contents inside, not because of their weight, but because of the ultimate meaning they held. 62 cents. A comb with a few teeth missing. And old letters the paper softened from being folded so many times. Those letters were once a source of hope. They were proof that somewhere, a man saw her as a woman worthy of a family. Now they are just pieces of paper. Clara suddenly realized that what suffocated her most wasn't the choices before her, but the fact that they all demanded she give up herself. A brothel where she would be fed, where she would sleep, but no longer Clara Hayes. Private service where she would be protected, but at the cost of lifelong silence. Or self-destruction where she would retain her name, but for an unknown period. There is no such thing as dignity. There are only different paths to losing it. "She needs time," Harlan said, his tone no longer sarcastic. Just factual. But not much. They turned away, leaving Clara standing there in front of the signless building under the darkening sky. Dusthaven didn't press. It just waited like a loan shark who knows the debtor will eventually return. Clara sat down on the low wooden steps in front of the door, her bag resting on her lap. She opened it for the first time since the carriage had left. Not to check its contents. She knew each item inside. She opened it to remind herself that she still existed. She held the broken comb, her fingers gently stroking the remaining teeth. She remembered those mornings brushing her hair in front of the mirror when she still believed that everything could start over. She remembered how she used to tell herself that the past doesn't define who she is. Then she took the letters. She didn't read them. She just touched them. They had completed their final task, bringing her here to confront the truth. In Dusthaven, no one hit her. No one pushed her around. But every word, every suggestion, every glance all combined to create an invisible pressure, forcing her to shrink, to become smaller until she fit perfectly into the roles that this society had prepared for her. That's when Clara Hayes realized the cruelest thing isn't violence, it's making you believe you don't deserve better. She stood up, not because she had made a decision, but because she knew that if she remained seated, Dusthaven would decide for her. Clara walked not toward the tavern, not toward the brothel, and not toward the road out of town. She simply walked to keep herself moving, to keep thinking, to keep living as a human being with the right to choose, even if that choice was being stifled. As night fell completely, Dusthaven became eerily quiet. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting to see where this woman would break. Clara Hayes stopped in the dim streetlights, the yellow light falling on her hands, still clutching her small bag. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew one thing for sure: if this was the end, she wouldn't enter it with her head bowed. And it was at that very moment, when Dusthaven believed she had reached a dead end, that something else was approaching, quietly, unobtrusively, but powerful enough to change the course of everything. Because sometimes when a person has been driven to the point of having nothing left to lose, a single calm voice spoken at the right moment is enough to bring an entire town to a standstill. Nights in Dusthaven are usually quiet. They settle like a closed trap, leaving a space so still that you can hear your own breath. Clara Hayes stood in the dark street, a small bag in her hand, the yellow streetlights illuminating her shoulders, weary from carrying too many decisions that weren't hers. The three men remained there, not surrounding her. There was no need to surround her. They stood scattered like invisible markers, delineating the boundaries Dusthaven had drawn for her. Harlan leaned against the wooden post in front of the pub. Cole stood askew toward the dark alley. Vic sat on the steps, one leg propped up, his eyes gazing up at the sky as if this were all too familiar. No one said anything, and it was that silence that made Clara feel suffocated. She understood that all the offers had been made. All the options had been explained. The rest was up to her, or rather up to her endurance. Dusthaven didn't need any more words. It just needed to wait. Clara took another step, then stopped. Not because she had made a decision, but because she heard the sound of horses' hooves in the distance. Slow, steady, unhurried. That sound didn't belong to Dusthaven. The people here walk. They don't come and go that way. The sound of approaching hooves cut through the silence like a new heartbeat just placed in the town's body. A man on horseback rode into the lamplight. The horse was tall, dark brown, and steady, as if accustomed to long journeys. The man sat upright, unassuming, and did not urge the horse faster than necessary. He wore an old coat, his hat pulled low, the appearance of someone who had worked outdoors long enough to no longer care about the gaze of others. His name is Jonah Caldwell. Jonah stopped his horse a few steps from Clara. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at Dusthaven, first the pub, the alley, the familiar figures. His gaze was slow, as if he were reading a book whose contents he already knew but still had to turn each page. Harlan straightened up. Cole shifted his weight. Vic put his foot down on the ground. No one greeted anyone, but everyone recognized the man. Jonah Caldwell is not from Dusthaven, and he's not a stranger either. He dismounted, tying the reins to a wooden post. Every movement was neat, unobtrusive. When he turned, his gaze rested on Clara Hayes. Not scrutinizing, not curious, just a look long enough to acknowledge her presence as a person, not a problem. "Are you all right?" Jonah asked. His voice was low and deep, not louder than necessary. There was no hint of pity in it, just a well-timed question. Clara didn't answer immediately. She wasn't used to being asked questions without conditions attached. Finally, she nodded. I can still stand." Jonah nodded in response, as if that answer was sufficient. He turned to the three men. His voice didn't change. His posture didn't change. He spoke only one sentence, slowly and clearly. "She's heard enough." No guns were drawn. No threats were made. No one screamed. But the atmosphere changed, not like a storm, but like the pressure in a room suddenly shifting. Dusthaven sensed it before anyone in it. Harlan gave a wry smile. "Jonah," he said, "we're just talking." Jonah looked at him. His gaze was neither cold nor warm. It was the look of someone who had made up their mind long ago and had no intention of negotiating. "This conversation is over," Jonah said. "With her." Cole stirred as if wanting to say something, but he didn't. Because everyone in Dusthaven knew one thing: Jonah Caldwell didn't say meaningless things. Vic looked at Jonah, then at Clara, then back at Jonah. He shrugged and stood up. "Not worth it," he muttered. Harlan remained silent for a few seconds, long enough to show that he didn't like being interrupted. But finally he nodded. "As you wish," he said. "Dusthaven is still here." "I know," Jonah replied. The three men retreated. Not quickly, not slowly. They vanished into the darkness like old habits temporarily interrupted. Dusthaven breathed a sigh of relief, not relief, but caution. Clara realized she was trembling, not from fear, but from the tension that had just been released. She stood still, not knowing what to say. Jonah turned around this time, looking directly at her. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. Clara shook her head. Jonah nodded as if he had anticipated that answer. "Then come with me." Not an invitation. Not a command. Just a simple statement placed in the right context. Clara looked at him. "You don't know who I am." "I know enough," Jonah said. "You don't belong here." He turned, untied the reins, and prepared to mount his horse. He didn't look back to see if she would follow. It wasn't necessary. He understood that people like Clara Hayes didn't need to be dragged along. They needed a door that demanded nothing to open. Clara stood there for a few seconds. Dusthaven remained behind her, the pub, the alley, the predetermined choices. In front of her was a man who promised nothing but clarity in his actions. She walked over. Jonah helped her onto the horse, his movements firm but maintaining a distance. Once she was seated securely, he mounted his own horse, sitting in front, leaving ample space. The horse began to move, slowly departing from the yellow lights of Dusthaven. No one chased after him. No one called out. The town stood still, as if memorizing the back of the man who had just entered and taken away something that Dusthaven considered its own. As they were leaving the main street, Clara spoke up, her voice low. "Why did you do that?" Jonah didn't turn around. "Because I don't like listening to overly long conversations." Clara nodded slightly. She didn't ask any further questions. At her age, she had learned that trustworthy people didn't need much explanation. The road ahead was darker, but the feeling of being trapped was gone. Clara watched the lights fading into the distance, and for the first time that day she allowed herself to breathe slowly. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for sure: tonight she wouldn't have to pay the price for her existence. And sometimes that initial trust doesn't come from grand promises, but from an offer clear enough not to come with any strings attached. The journey away from Dusthaven stretched on in silence. Not the heavy silence Clara Hayes had felt when she stood in the dark street, but a different kind of silence. A silence with rhythm, breath, and space for thought. The horse trotted steadily, its hooves firmly planted, as if each step knew exactly where it was going. Jonah Caldwell said nothing for the first part of the journey. He didn't ask about Clara's past. He didn't ask why she had come to Dusthaven. He didn't ask the questions people usually ask when they think they have a right to know. For Jonah, silence wasn't a void to be filled, it was a form of respect. Clara sat in the back, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her small bag pressed close to her body. She watched the man's back, steady, unpretentious, the kind of man accustomed to taking care of himself. She didn't know much about Jonah Caldwell, but she knew he didn't speak unnecessarily. And at his age, that was a kind of security. The sky gradually brightened as they turned off the main road. Dusthaven receded behind them, disappearing into dust and shadows. Ahead, the land opened up wide open spaces, a steady breeze, the smell of dry grass and damp earth. Clara sensed the change not only in the scenery but in her own breath. Stone Ridge Farm came into view as the sun rose above the horizon. Not large, not new. A simple low-roofed log cabin, its fence old but still sturdy. The stables were askew, the tool shed at the back. Everything bore the marks of time, not abandonment but regular, unassuming care. Jonah dismounted first, tied the reins, then turned to help Clara. His movements were decisive, maintaining just the right distance. Only when she was firmly on the ground did he release her hand. "This is Stone Ridge," Jonah said. No introduction. No explanation. Clara looked around. There was no one else. No curious glances. No scrutiny. Only the wind rustling through the fields and the gentle creaking of wood in the early morning sun. "Does he live alone?" Clara asked. "Yeah," Jonah replied. "I'm used to it." He opened the door. Inside it was neat and simple. A wooden dining table, 2 chairs. A small clean kitchen. No superfluous items. No sign of wealth. But neither was there any lack. Stone Ridge didn't promise much, and precisely because of that it didn't deceive anyone. Jonah placed Clara's bag down beside the chair. "You can rest for a while," he said. "Then we'll talk." Clara sat down. She wasn't tired in the way of someone who had just traveled a long distance. She was tired in the way of someone who had been on alert for too long. When Jonah placed a glass of water in front of her and then turned to light the fire, she noticed something that surprised her. He didn't stand and watch her drink. There was no pity in his eyes, no curiosity. Jonah let her exist as an adult, to take care of even the smallest things for herself. As the kitchen warmed up, Jonah sat opposite Clara. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't beat around the bush. "I need people to do the work," he said. Stone Ridge isn't self-sufficient. Clara nodded. She had been waiting for that. I can work, she said. I'm not weak. Jonah looked at her, his eyes calm. I'm not looking for the weak. He placed a piece of paper on the table with a few lines of handwritten text. This is the job, he said. Taking care of chickens. Gardening. Cooking. Cleaning. Nothing complicated. Clara read slowly. She was used to carefully reading anything that concerned her. And the room, a private room, Jonah replied. It has a lock. Wage, Jonah stated the number. Not high, not low. Clear. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. A question that had been lingering in her mind since leaving Dusthaven had finally found a place to surface. What do you want from me, she asked. Her voice didn't tremble. Not defiant. Just someone who had learned that every offer has a price. Jonah didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window where sunlight was flooding the room. Then he turned back. It's work, he said. That's all. Clara blinked. Not because she hadn't heard clearly, but because she wasn't used to that answer. Are there no other conditions, she asked. Jonah shook his head. No. A silence fell. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was open. Clara looked at the paper again. The job. A private office. A clear salary. No quid pro quo. No insinuations. No invisible noose around her neck. She placed her hand on the small bag beside the chair. 62 cents. A broken comb. Old letters. All she had brought with her from a world that had broken its promises, and now before her was an offer that promised nothing but fairness. I don't know how long I'll be able to stay, Clara said. It doesn't matter, Jonah replied. Just work while she's here. Clara nodded. Not because she believed, but because she accepted the challenge. At this age, trying to believe again was no longer naivety, it was a conscious decision. Jonah stood up. Your room is in the back, he said. You can rest there. I'll show you a few things this afternoon. Clara stood up. As she walked past him, Jonah took a half step back, keeping his distance. Not out of coldness, but because he understood the boundaries. The back room was small but clean. A single bed, a small table, a window overlooking the fields, and a door with a lock, small details, but enough for Clara to feel empowered to shut off the world when needed. She sat down on the bed, not lying down, just sitting to feel the stillness. Stone Ridge didn't heal her immediately, but it didn't hurt her any further. In the afternoon, Clara began her work, taking care of the chickens, collecting eggs. Jonah gave brief instructions, nothing more, nothing less. No control, no nitpicking. When she worked slowly, he waited. When she made a mistake, he corrected her. No scolding, no condescension. In the evening, Clara prepared a simple meal. Jonah ate at the same table but didn't look at her for too long. He didn't ask any personal questions. He only talked about work the next day. As night fell on Stone Ridge, Clara stood on the porch gazing at the star-filled sky. She realized she was no longer hunched over as she had been in Dusthaven. Her shoulders slumped. Her breathing deepened. She hasn't called this place home yet. She hasn't called Jonah Caldwell a trustworthy person. But for the first time in a long time, Clara Hayes felt that her existence didn't need justification. And sometimes the first thing that heals a person isn't love, but a place that has kept its promises even in the smallest ways. Stone Ridge didn't change much in the morning. It didn't try to appear more welcoming with the arrival of more people. No renovations. No tidying up to impress. The farm remained its old, simple appearance, as if it only knew how to do its job to provide shelter from the rain and wind, and to keep its promises through action. Clara Hayes awoke as the first rays of light streamed through the small window in her room. There was no doorbell. No one was calling. Only the gentle breeze rustling through the fields and the soft creaking of wood under the roof. She lay still for a moment, listening to make sure she was in a place that demanded nothing the moment she opened her eyes. She sat up slowly. The wooden floor was cool under her feet. There were no footsteps in the hallway. No feeling of being watched. Just silence, not empty but full enough that one didn't need to be on guard. The room door was closed. Clara stood up and placed her hand on the lock. She turned it gently. The lock was still there. Not removed. Not opened. Secretly. A small detail, but for someone who had lived for so long in unsafe spaces, it meant more than any reassurance. Clara washed her face and combed her hair with the broken comb. She didn't have a new one yet, but she didn't feel the need to rush. In Stone Ridge, time doesn't force people to become someone else. When she stepped into the main room, Jonah Caldwell was already there. He stood with his back to her, lighting the stove, his movements slow and familiar. He didn't turn immediately at the sound of her footsteps. Not out of carelessness, but because he didn't consider her presence something that needed to be acknowledged. "Good morning," Clara said softly. "Hello," Jonah replied in a flat tone. He placed a simple plate of food on the table, bread, eggs, a little cold cuts. Not much, but enough. The food was hot, subtly fragrant, and unpretentious. Clara sat down. She realized she was hungry, not a ravenous hunger, but the kind of hunger a person accustomed to starving for the sake of appearances. She picked up the bread, her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but because she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten without paying a price. Jonah sat opposite her. He ate his portion. But he didn't look at Clara as she ate. No glance. No observation. No sympathy. He let her eat in complete privacy, a form of silent respect whose value only those who have known how to maintain boundaries can understand. Clara ate slowly. Not because she was weak, but because she was relearning to trust that this meal wouldn't be taken away midway. As she put down the last piece of cake, she realized her throat was constricting, not from overwhelming emotion, but because her body was slowly letting its guard down. After the meal, Jonah stood up. "There wasn't much to do today," he said. "You can rest more if you want." "I can help," Clara replied. "I'd like to get acquainted." Jonah nodded. "As you wish." They started with small things. Jonah showed her how to organize the kitchen for convenience, how to store farming tools so she wouldn't have to search for them for long. No lengthy explanations. No orders. Just sharing habits formed over years of living alone. Clara realized Stone Ridge wasn't just clean, it was well maintained. There were no superfluous items. No corner was neglected. Everything had its place, as if the house had learned not to demand too much from its inhabitants. At lunchtime, Jonah went outside to check the fence. Clara stayed inside, cleaning slowly. She wasn't trying to do too well. Not trying to prove anything. She was just doing her part, as Jonah had said. When Jonah returned, he glanced around. No nod of approval. No comment. But he pulled up another chair and placed it closer to the table. That small detail went unspoken, but Clara understood. At Stone Ridge, recognition didn't need to be announced. The afternoon passed in a steady rhythm. There were no climaxes. No dramatic events. But it was precisely this tranquility that Clara needed most. After days, perhaps years, she no longer had to guess what others were thinking of her. As dusk fell, Clara stood on the back porch watching the light slant across the field. Jonah stood a few steps away, adjusting a loose wooden beam. They didn't speak, but the silence between them no longer took the form of fear. "How long will I be here?" Clara asked without turning around. Jonah didn't answer immediately. He tapped lightly on the wooden beam as if considering his options. "How long do you want to work?" he said. "Stone Ridge doesn't fire anyone if they keep their word." Clara nodded. She didn't ask any further questions. At her age, she had learned that the best answers usually didn't require lengthy explanations. That evening, they had another simple meal. Jonah talked about the weather, about the possibility of a dry season, about the fence needing repairs. He didn't ask about Clara's past. Not because he wasn't curious, but because he didn't consider her past a condition for her staying. After the meal, Clara washed the dishes. Jonah didn't stop her. He didn't help. Not because he was lazy, but because he understood that doing chores was also a form of autonomy. When everything was done, Clara returned to her room. She closed the door, locked it, sighted down on the bed, not to fall asleep immediately, but to fully savor the moment. Stone Ridge doesn't promise happiness. It doesn't heal wounds overnight, but it keeps its word. Here, no one watches her eat. No one asks her what price she has to pay to stay. No one crosses the boundary without being invited. Clara Hayes lay down her hand on her chest, feeling her heartbeat slow. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to think about how she would survive tomorrow. She only thought about what she would do tomorrow. And in that small locked room in an old but decent house, Clara understood that safety didn't need to be loud to be acknowledged. Because when a person is placed in a space where promises are kept long enough, it is their daily work that begins to do what no one else can heal them from within. The days at Stone Ridge weren't measured by events. They were measured by a rhythmic pattern, by lights flashing on and off, by beginnings and endings on time. And it was within this regular rhythm that Clara Hayes gradually relearned how to survive without being defensive. The morning began with the clucking of chickens in the backyard. Clara woke up before Jonah went to his coop. No one asked her to. No one reminded her. She simply found herself accustomed to opening her eyes to the light, as if her body had recalled a very old memory, a memory of being needed. Clara put on her coat, slipped on her shoes, and stepped out onto the porch. The cool morning breeze carried the scent of damp grass. She went straight to the chicken coop, opened the door, and scattered the feed. The chickens crowded around, scurrying noisily, so carefree that Clara smiled softly. They didn't know who she was. They didn't care about her past. They only knew that she had arrived on time, brought food, and that was all. Clara picked up the eggs one by one and placed them in the basket. She was careful not because she was afraid of breaking them, but because she was doing something with a specific meaning. These eggs would become a meal. Not a promise, not a hope, but the direct result of doing her part. Then came the garden. Stone Ridge's soil wasn't pleasantly fertile. It needed tilling, watering, and time. Clara knelt her hands, touching the ground. Her back ached slightly, an old bruise hadn't completely healed. But the pain no longer startled her. It was there, a reminder that her body was still working to heal. Clara moved slowly. Jonah didn't rush her. He stood at a distance, adjusting the fence, glancing over occasionally but not watching. He didn't approach to help unless she asked. Not because he was inconsiderate, but because he understood that maintaining boundaries was also a form of respect. At lunchtime, Clara went into the kitchen. She cooked simple dishes, soup, bread, eggs. No experimentation. No attempt to impress. She cooked the way she did everything at Stone Ridge, just enough, warm enough, not too much. Jonah ate at the same table. He talked about the weather, about the fields to the west needing more water, about winter possibly coming early. He didn't ask about the bruise on Clara's hand. He didn't ask about her sleepless night. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't consider those things topics to be explored. Clara realized this wasn't aloofness. It was inner discipline. Jonah Caldwell had chosen to keep his distance so as not to turn kindness into control. And at her age, Clara understood that men like him were rare. In the afternoon, Clara did her laundry. She hung the clothes on the line one by one to air dry. The sunlight revealed the frayed edges of the fabric just as the light had once revealed the wounds on her body. But unlike Dusthaven and Stone Ridge, no one looked to judge. With each passing day, Clara's body changed slowly. The bruises faded. The pain didn't disappear, but it became less noticeable. More importantly, her self-esteem began to return, not through words of affirmation, but through the feeling of standing tall after a full day's work. There were afternoons when Clara was so tired that she would sit down on the steps saying nothing. Jonah would walk by, place a glass of water beside her. No questions asked, no comforting words. Then he would go on his way. The gesture was so small it could easily be overlooked, but Clara didn't overlook it. She remembered it. Not out of gratitude, but to understand that kindness can exist without being mentioned. On rainy days, they stayed indoors. Clara mended clothes. Jonah repaired farm tools. No one spoke of their lives. But in that silence, Clara realized one thing: she no longer had to hide herself to stay. Her work spoke for itself. One evening while Clara was cooking, she accidentally dropped a wooden spoon. The sound of it hitting the floor startled her, her heart racing. It was an old reflex. Jonah was sitting at the table, his back turned. He didn't turn. He didn't ask. He didn't comment. Clara bent down to pick up the spoon, her hands trembling slightly, then composed herself. After the meal, Jonah stood up. "Tomorrow I need to repair the north barn," he said. "If you'd like to help, I can show you." Clara nodded. "I want to." There were no words of praise, no words of encouragement. But within those words was trust, something that cannot be bought, cannot be begged for, and can only be given when one has proven themselves worthy through action. Time passed in Stone Ridge, with the seasons. Clara realized she had begun anticipating the work before Jonah even spoke. She knew when to harvest the eggs early, when to shield the vegetables from the dew, when to let the soil rest. Small decisions, but decisions of her own, something she had been deprived of in Dusthaven. Jonah maintained absolute boundaries. He didn't enter Clara's room. He didn't ask where she went when she left the farm for hours. He didn't offer private advice. And because of this, Clara began to feel safe enough to speak up when needed. One evening after they had finished cleaning up, Clara whispered, "I'm not used to being treated like this." Jonah didn't ask how. He just nodded. "Many people don't know him. Aren't you afraid I'll leave?" Clara asked. Jonah thought for a moment. "Everyone has the right to leave," he said. "But people who do a good job usually don't abandon their work halfway." That statement wasn't meant to keep them. It simply confirmed one thing at Stone Ridge: people are judged by how they work, not by what they've been through. As night fell, Clara lay in her room, the door locked as usual. She placed her hand on her chest, feeling her heartbeat become more regular. No longer startled by the slightest sound. No longer feeling the need to prove her existence. She thought of Dusthaven not with fear, but with clarity. She understood that she hadn't broken there. She had simply been placed in a place where human dignity was not permitted. And now at Stone Ridge, labor was doing what pity could never do, restoring her self-respect little by little. Clara Hayes didn't call it healing. She called it work. And in the rhythmic chores of chickens, earth, fire, and fences, she began to believe she could stand firm, not because someone had saved her, but because she was rebuilding herself with hands that still trembled but never gave up. But where people begin to stand tall again, the past rarely rests in peace, and very soon whispers from Dusthaven will find their way back to Stone Ridge. Not all danger comes with a loud noise. In the borderlands, some things return very slowly, like a cold breeze creeping through a crack in the door, just enough to make one realize that peaceful times never last forever. The rumors started in Dusthaven. No one knows exactly who started it. It could have been someone who had drunk too much. It could have been someone who had been standing on the street corner the day Clara Hayes was taken away. Rumors don't need a clear source, they just need to be something that society wants to believe. Jonah Caldwell is hiding a beaten woman. No papers. No husband. Her background is unknown. Those words traveled from the pub to the shop, from the dining table to the doorstep. Each time they were repeated, they needed no further proof, only a false sense of certainty. Dusthaven disliked things that were out of control, and a woman disappearing from the main street and settling comfortably in Stone Ridge was something that made the town uneasy. Stone Ridge didn't hear the rumors immediately. It was far enough away that the Dusthaven winds arrived more slowly. But nowhere is far enough away for the past to remain dormant forever. Clara Hayes was the first to sense the change. Not through words, but through the air. The cars passing by the farm slowed down. Gazes from afar lingered longer. There were afternoons when Clara was gardening and saw a figure standing at the edge of the field, not calling out, not approaching, just watching as if acknowledging her presence. Clara didn't say anything to Jonah at first, not because she didn't trust him, but because she was used to the idea that danger always came from what was left unsaid. But then one morning, when Jonah returned from the nearby small town after buying supplies, he set the bag down on the table more slowly than usual. "Someone asked about her," he said, his voice still even. Clara stopped what she was doing. Without turning around, she asked, "What did they ask?" Jonah took off his gloves and placed them on the table. "They asked who she was and why she was here." Clara took a deep breath. A familiar feeling returned, not fear, but the vigilance that had saved her so many times before. "What did he say?" "That's true," Jonah replied. "She works here." Clara nodded. "That's enough." Jonah said nothing more. But Clara knew when a man like Jonah Caldwell mentioned something, it meant it wasn't a small matter anymore. A few days later, the man appeared. Edward Lane arrived at Stone Ridge on a scorching midday. He rode a fine horse, wore a more expensive coat than necessary, and had his hat neatly tied back, the appearance of someone who believed himself protected by social order. Clara saw him from afar. She didn't need an introduction. There are faces that don't need names because they've already occupied too much space in her memory. Her heart skipped a beat, then calmed down, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she had learned to stand still when she was afraid. Edward Lane dismounted, adjusted his coat, and surveyed Stone Ridge with a scrutinizing gaze. No contempt, no surprise, just the confidence of someone who knows they possess something others lack, the law in their pocket. "Jonah Caldwell," he called, his voice just loud enough to assert his right to speak. Jonah emerged from the warehouse, wiping his hands on a towel. He showed no surprise, nor did he appear friendly. "Edward Lane," Jonah replied. "He's gone." Edward gave a wry smile. "Because it's important." He looked at Clara. His gaze swept over her as if she were a lost object. No more desire, no more feigned tenderness, only a challenged possessiveness. I've come to pick up my fiancée, Edward said. The atmosphere around Stone Ridge seemed to freeze. Clara took a step forward. Not trembling. Not hiding. I am not your wife. Edward tilted his head. You have a letter. There's an agreement. A letter is not a marriage, Clara said. And you know that. Edward chuckled softly. The law is different. He pulled a stack of papers from his jacket. Not in a hurry. Not ostentatious. But everyone saw it. A complaint, he said. Regarding unlawful detention. Concealment. Illegal labor. Jonah looked at the stack of papers, then at Edward. She works here, he said. Volunteering. Edward shrugged. The law doesn't care about voluntariness if the person doesn't have a clear position. Clara listened to every word. They weren't new. She'd heard similar phrases in Dusthaven, only this time they were printed on paper. He deceived me, Clara said. He hit me. He abandoned me. Edward looked at her, his eyes turning cold. There's no evidence. He turned to Jonah. And you, Edward said, you should be careful. You're a man of reputation. You shouldn't let a woman of unknown origin drag you into trouble. Jonah didn't answer immediately. He looked at Clara. Not asking. Not reassuring. Just a look that was enough to say he saw her not as a problem but as a person being treated unjustly. Stone Ridge doesn't hold people, Jonah said slowly. She can leave any time. Edward smiled. Then I'll go back with the deputy. He turned, mounted his horse, and said nothing more. Like someone who had completed their part of the job, sowing enough doubt, applying enough pressure, gathering enough paperwork for the system to begin to move. When Edward Lane left, Stone Ridge fell silent again. But it was no longer a safe silence. Clara stood still. She sensed clearly that the past had not returned merely to threaten it, had returned to take away what she had just built. I can leave, Clara said, her voice low, before things get more complicated. Jonah turned to her. Not hurried. Not angry. You did nothing wrong. The law doesn't care, Clara replied. Jonah nodded. I know. They stood there in the middle of the field, two people who understood all too well an old truth of the frontier. The law usually sided with the one who had the right to speak first. Clara looked at Stone Ridge, the fence, the chicken coop, the garden. Things she had helped rebuild. Not a dream. Not an illusion. The result of real labor. I don't want him to lose everything because of me, Clara said. Jonah gazed into the distance towards the road leading to Dusthaven. There are things worth keeping, he said. And there are things that shouldn't be left for others to decide. Clara didn't reply. But something began to shift within her. She realized that this time the threat wasn't directed solely at her but at the very justice that Stone Ridge represented. And as the evening breeze swept across the fields, carrying dust from the road Edward Lane had just traveled, Clara Hayes understood that the peace she had found was not a reward but a new challenge. Because when the past returns with the seal of the law, the question is no longer who is right, but who dares to stand up and say that human beings are not property. The deputy arrived at Stone Ridge on a windless morning. The sky was so clear that everything seemed straighter than it actually was. On the frontier, days like these often carried an unnameable atmosphere, not peace, but a sense of order. Clara Hayes saw him from her window. A middle-aged man wearing a dark brown coat with an iron star pinned to his chest rode slowly through the farm gate on horseback. Unhurried, unstressed, as if he were simply performing a familiar task without much thought. Jonah Caldwell was outside in the yard when the deputy approached. He didn't step forward. He didn't take cover. He just stood in his place, a landowner waiting to see what the system would say. The deputy dismounted, adjusted his belt, and his gaze swept across Stone Ridge, the fence, the chicken coop, the garden. He looked like someone accustomed to judging everything by its documentation, not by the story behind it. Jonah Caldwell, he said. I'm Miller, the deputy sheriff of the county. I know, Jonah replied. You arrived early. Miller nodded. There's a complaint. It doesn't need to be specified who it is. In places like this, complaints rarely come from the weak. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She didn't hide inside the house. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had learned that hiding didn't soften the system. Jonah looked at her a quick glance, but enough to say he wasn't surprised. Miller looked at Clara. His gaze was neither hostile nor warm. It was the look of someone who had already decided not to let emotions slow down their work. Are you Clara Hayes? He asked. Yes, Clara replied. Do you have any identification? Clara shook her head. No. Miller took notes. How long has she been here? A few weeks. What is your relationship with Mr. Caldwell? Jonah spoke before Clara could reply. No interrupting. No raising his voice. Just a well-timed remark. She's my employee, Jonah said. She gets paid. She has her own room. Miller looked up at Jonah. Is there a contract? No, Jonah replied. We made a verbal agreement. Miller let out a short, almost inaudible sigh. You know that the law prefers paper to words. Jonah nodded. I know. Miller turned to Clara. Were you forced to stay here? Clara looked straight ahead. No. Were you detained against your will? Are not. Miller added, do you know Edward Lane? Clara was silent for a second. Yes. He said she was his fiancée. He said a lot of things, Clara replied. But he didn't marry me. Miller didn't react. He just took notes. As if the truth were just one item on a list, nothing more. Jonah looked at the deputy, his expression unchanged. She's an employee, he repeated. Not property. The words fell into the empty courtyard heavier than any accusation. Miller stopped writing. He looked at Jonah longer. You're right, he said. In theory. Clara sensed it the way he added those two words, in theory. As if justice were something beautiful in books, but in real life it needed to be adjusted. But Miller continued. Edward Lane has correspondence. There's an agreement sent by mail. The law considers that evidence of intent. The intention is not marriage, Jonah said. No, Miller agreed. But it's enough to cause trouble. Clara heard something familiar in that statement. Laws don't need to be right. They just need to be complicated enough to wear down the weak. What are you planning to do? Jonah asked. Miller looked around Stone Ridge again. I wasn't planning on doing anything. I was just checking it out. And the conclusion? Jonah asked. Miller shrugged. I'll report back that she's here voluntarily. Clara breathed a sigh of relief, but only for a moment, because Miller hadn't stopped yet. But he continued, I will also report that her situation is unclear. And if Edward Lane continues to pursue this, it could escalate further. Where are we going? Clara asked. The district court, Miller replied. Where the law is read. Jonah looked directly at the deputy. And whose side will those words be on? Miller remained silent. Not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to say something everyone already understood. He's a man of integrity, Miller said in conclusion. Jonah Caldwell. He shouldn't get himself involved in shady dealings. Jonah didn't react immediately. When he did speak, his voice was even. Keeping employees is not a shady business. Miller nodded as if he had anticipated the answer. No. But protecting them from the law is complicated. He turned to Clara. You should think about it, Miller said. There are battles that aren't worth a single woman taking on alone. Clara looked at him. Not angry. Not pleading. I'm not fighting, she said. I'm just working. Miller gave a wry smile. The law doesn't discriminate. The deputy policeman mounted his horse and adjusted his hat. I'll report back, he said. For now. As he left Stone Ridge, a light dust rose, then settled. No one spoke for several minutes. The space became quiet again, but it was no longer a safe silence. It carried a legitimate threat. Clara stood still. She felt a weariness different from that of labor. It was the weariness of knowing she was being weighed against things she had no control over. I can leave, Clara said again. Go somewhere else. Before this gets out of hand. Jonah looked at her. He didn't object immediately. He didn't reassure her. He considered his words something he always did before speaking. She has the right to leave, he said. But she is not obligated to do so just because others refuse to do things properly. Clara bowed her head. The law won't be on my side. Jonah nodded. Maybe. So why are you still standing here? Clara asked. Jonah looked toward the road leading to Dusthaven, where the deputy sheriff had just left. Because if everyone backed down when the law looked elsewhere, he said, then people like Edward Lane would never have to stop. Clara was silent. Something stirred within her. Not blind hope, but clarity. She understood that this time the story wasn't just about her. It was about whether one dared to name what was right even when the system refused to listen. Evening descends on Stone Ridge. Clara returns to her work, tending the chickens, watering the garden, not to escape, but to keep herself grounded. Jonah repairs the fence, not to protect the land, but to keep things running despite the pressure. They didn't talk much, but amidst the steady rhythm of their work, they both knew the waves had begun to rise. And this time it carries the seal of the law. Because when the system speaks out against the principles of justice, the only thing left for people is to decide to continue running away or to stand up and speak for themselves. Night fell slowly on Stone Ridge, as if even the sky needed time to come to terms with the day's events. Clara Hayes sat on the back porch steps, her hands resting on her knees, her back straighter than it had been in weeks. Before her stretched the darkening field where the wind blew gently, carrying the familiar scent of earth and dry grass. She can leave. The thought came to her clearly, without panic. Clara had lived long enough to know when an escape route opened. She could go north where few people knew her name. She could find work in another smaller town where rumors from Dusthaven hadn't yet taken root. She could pack her small bag, 62 pence, a broken comb, old letters, and leave Stone Ridge before the law could erect another barrier. Clara had done it many times in her life. Leave. Avoid. Start over somewhere else, hoping that this time the past wouldn't catch up. She knew how to neatly package her pain, how to remain silent when necessary, how to survive without leaving a trace. But tonight, as she looked down the dimly lit road leading away from the farm, Clara realized something that surprised her. The thought of leaving no longer brought her relief. Jonah Caldwell stepped out onto the porch and stood a few steps away from her. He didn't ask what she was thinking. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that important decisions needed to be discussed when people were ready. "The deputy will be back," Jonah said, his voice low and even. "Maybe not soon, but he will be." Clara nodded. She already knew that. "Edward Lane won't stop." "No," Jonah replied. "He believes the law is on his side." Clara looked down at her hands. The bruises had faded, leaving only faint marks. She gently touched them, as if to remind herself that this body had endured and still stood strong. "I can leave," Clara said finally, "before things get worse." Jonah didn't object. He looked out at the field where darkness had fallen. "She has the right to do so." Clara turned to him. "Aren't you going to advise me to leave?" Jonah shook his head. "I wouldn't advise anyone to run away," he said. "But I wouldn't keep anyone here either." The silence between them wasn't heavy. It took the form of respect, the very foundation of Stone Ridge. Clara took a deep breath. When she spoke, her voice was firmer than she had imagined. "I'm tired," she said. "Tired from running." The words fell on the wooden porch, not loud but clear. It wasn't a complaint. It was an acknowledgement. Clara continued slowly, as if rereading her life story in someone else's voice. "Every time I left, I thought I was protecting myself. But in reality, I was just letting others decide who I was." Jonah turned to look at her. No surprise. No pity. Just listening. "I ran away from empty promises," Clara said. "I ran away from judgmental stares. I ran away from hands that weren't allowed to touch me. And I ran away from myself, from the woman who knew she deserved better." She looked up, meeting her gaze. "I'm not weak," Clara said. "I was just forced to be weak." Jonah nodded. Not to agree, but to confirm that he heard clearly. "Staying will come at a price," Jonah said. He didn't beat around the bush. "The law doesn't always side with the right person. Edward Lane will take this far. There could be court cases. There could be losses." Clara did not back down from that warning. She had heard enough sweet promises in her life. What she needed now was the truth unembellished. "I know," she said. "But if I leave, I'll carry the same fear with me to another place. And then I'll just run again." The wind picked up a little harder. Jonah folded his arms and leaned lightly against the porch post. He wasn't trying to convince Clara. He understood that this decision didn't need anyone else's approval to be right. "Stone Ridge isn't a completely safe place," Jonah said. "It's just a place that keeps its word." Clara smiled very slightly. "That's enough for me." She stood up, not like someone preparing for a major battle, but like someone who had finally found their footing and could no longer slip. "I'm going to stay," Clara said. "Not because of you, not because of Stone Ridge, but because I'm tired of leaving behind what I built with my own hands." Jonah looked at her longer. "I won't promise to protect you from everything," he said, "but I won't leave you alone." Clara nodded. "I don't need anyone standing in front of me," she said. "Just not being pushed to the back." They stood there, two people who had chosen a difficult path. There was no formal handshake, no vows, only a silent agreement that from now on every step would have meaning. In the days that followed, Clara continued her routine. She tended the chickens, watered the garden, and cooked. But one thing had changed. She was no longer working to escape. She was working to assert her presence in Stone Ridge. On some afternoons, Clara would gaze toward Dusthaven, where the dust of the road blurred into the distance. She wasn't afraid. She simply observed. The past was still there like an old tree's shadow, but this time she wasn't standing in its shadow. Jonah didn't change his behavior. He still kept his boundaries. He still spoke little. He still worked regularly. But Clara noticed he was starting to state more explicitly in front of others that she worked at Stone Ridge, that she was paid, that she was there by choice. Those statements weren't meant to challenge the law. They were meant to restore the truth to the public sphere, something Clara had been deprived of. One evening, as they sat down to eat, Jonah whispered, "If this goes too far, we might have to go back to Dusthaven." Clara put down her spoon. Without hesitation, she said, "I'm ready." Jonah looked at her. "They'll be looking at you." "I'm used to it," Clara replied. "But this time, I won't bow my head." That statement didn't carry any arrogance. It carried the serenity of someone who had made up their mind. That night, Clara locked her bedroom door as usual. But when she lay down, she no longer thought about leaving. She thought about tomorrow, about collecting the eggs early, about the garden needing more water, about specific things that anchored her to the present. Clara Hayes understood that standing still wouldn't make life easier, but it would make life more authentic. And at this age, being true to yourself was more important than a false sense of security. Because once a person chooses to stand firm, the next step is no longer to hide, but to walk straight into the gaze of society, to reclaim their dignity where it was once taken away. The road back to Dusthaven remained unchanged. It was still the same dirt road with its familiar bends and the old tire tracks deeply etched in the dust. But for Clara Hayes, the feeling of walking on this road was different. No longer the trembling of someone left behind. No longer the fear of wondering how she would be seen. She no longer turned her back on the past. She walked straight into it. Jonah Caldwell rode alongside Clara. He neither went ahead nor lagged behind. Their paces were equal, as if both understood that today was not a day for protection through action, but a day for presence through honor. Dusthaven loomed in the distance, its low wooden houses, the pub on the corner, the police station with its iron star still hanging silently. Nothing had changed formally. But Clara knew all too well every eye in this town remembered her. As they entered the main street, the voices faded and then fell silent, not out of respect, but out of curiosity, and perhaps a little unease. People looked at Clara Hayes no longer as a woman standing alone. They looked at her as a question returning, a question Dusthaven thought it had answered by ignoring it. Whispers began to rise, not loud, not clear, but enough to form a familiar wave of sound. "That's her. That woman. I heard she's with Jonah Caldwell. I don't know if it's true or false." Clara heard it all. But she didn't lower her head. She didn't look down. She walked slowly, her back straight, as if each step was a way of saying, "I'm not hiding anymore." Jonah stopped his horse in the middle of the main street. Not on the edge. Not in a less noticeable spot. He chose the exact place where Clara had stood alone on the first day, where no one greeted her, no one asked her anything, only scrutinizing glances. Clara dismounted. She stood beside Jonah, neither clinging to him nor hiding behind him. The distance between them was just enough to say they were walking together, but neither was obscuring the other. People were coming out of the pub. People were stopping at the grocery store. Dusthaven Main Street was getting crowded, not because of an event, but because society always gathers when it's about to judge someone. Jonah Caldwell looked around. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't sound challenging. When he spoke, his voice wasn't louder than necessary, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is Clara Hayes," he said. He called her by her name. Not that woman, not she, but by the full name of a person. In that moment, Clara felt something strange, as if a part of her had been put back in its place. She was used to being called by other names: burden, trouble, merchandise. But here in Dusthaven, Jonah called her by name and without asking anyone's permission to do so. "She works at Stone Ridge Farm," Jonah continued. "She gets paid. She has her own room. She's there by choice. A man in the pub chuckled softly. So you're hiding someone? Jonah turned to the man. Not angry. Not contemptuous. No, he said. I'm being clear. Clara looked at the faces around her. Some avoided her gaze. Some looked straight at her. Some seemed annoyed that the familiar order was being disrupted. Dusthaven was unaccustomed to a woman standing in the middle of the street without being pushed aside. Someone said she was Edward Lane's fiancée, another voice chimed in. Clara took a deep breath. She wasn't waiting for Jonah to speak for her. This was her moment. I am not Edward Lane's wife, Clara said. Her voice was steady, not loud, but clear. I was never his property. A silence fell. Not because everyone agreed, but because no one was used to a woman speaking on her own behalf in front of a crowd. Letters are not marriage, Clara continued. Promises are not ownership. Jonah didn't interrupt. He stood still, allowing Clara to take the space where she was entitled to stand. Some shook their heads. Some whispered. But there were other gazes, the gazes of those who had lived long enough to understand that not everything protected by law is right. Clara looked around Dusthaven. She looked at the pub where her worth had once been measured by half-joking, half-serious remarks. She looked at the shop where she had once been seen as a burden. She looked at the police station where silence had once been used as a tool. I didn't come here to ask for pity, Clara said. I came here to say that I'm making a living from the work of my labor. And I'm not going to leave just because of whispers. Jonah took half a step forward, not occupying the platform, just standing alongside. She doesn't owe Dusthaven any explanation, he said. But if this town needs to hear the truth, then this is the truth. An elderly woman standing at the edge of the crowd gazed at Clara for a long time. Then she nodded very slightly. Not a big gesture, but Clara saw it, and she understood true change is never loud. No one applauded, no one cheered, but no one chased them away either. Dusthaven stood there like an old body forced to look at itself in the mirror. Jonah turned to Clara. We're done, he said. Clara nodded. She didn't feel victorious. She felt relieved, not because everyone believed her, but because she hadn't remained silent. They turned their backs and left the main street. No hurry, no look back. But Clara knew from today on Dusthaven would no longer remember her as a woman who arrived empty-handed. They would remember her as the one who had turned back and called her by her own name. As they left town, the sun was setting. Its rays illuminated the long, straight dirt road. Clara took a deep breath. The air carried the familiar smell of dust, but this time it didn't make her feel small. Thank you, Clara said without looking at Jonah. Jonah shook his head. You've already done the hardest part yourself. Clara smiled. Not the smile of someone who had just been rescued, but the smile of someone who had just restored her dignity to where it had been taken away. Dusthaven was left behind with unanswered questions, but Clara Hayes no longer needed the town to answer them for her. And once dignity has been publicly declared, only one more line needs to be drawn to force society to choose between principle and old habits. Dusthaven didn't forget as quickly as it thought. After Clara Hayes and Jonah Caldwell left the main street, the town didn't get any better, it just became quieter. And in that silence, what goes unspoken tends to find its way back up, more distorted and venomous. Clara knew that. She had lived long enough to understand that society would not forgive those who dared to stand tall in its presence. But she did not expect the next test to come so quickly and so brutally. It was a morning a few days after they had returned to Dusthaven to buy supplies. The main street wasn't crowded, but there were enough people for every word spoken to be overheard. Clara stood in front of the grocery store waiting for Jonah to pay inside. She stood upright, her hands clasped in front of her stomach, her gaze calmly fixed on the street. A man walked out of the pub. Not drunk, not loud, but confident enough to believe he had the right to say things he shouldn't. So you're still hanging around here, huh? He said, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. I thought Stone Ridge was such a nice place. Clara turned around. She looked at him. Not immediately recognized, but not really. People like that don't need names to be identified. They all have the same tone, half teasing, half insulting, completely certain that no one will hold them accountable. I was just asking, he continued with a wry smile. Or maybe they pay you in a different way there. A few soft laughs rang out. Not overtly malicious, but enough to hurt if one bowed their head. Clara did not bow her head. She stood still, neither moving forward nor backward, and often they fell to the ground and were never picked up. But this time, Jonah Caldwell walked out of the store. He didn't walk quickly. He didn't stride straight ahead. He stopped a few steps away, just enough for everyone to see him. Jonah didn't look at Clara first. He looked at the other man. "What did he say?" Jonah asked. His voice wasn't high, not heavy, but clear enough to cut through the air. The man forced a smile. "I was just joking." Jonah nodded. "Then you wouldn't mind revising that statement." What? The other person frowned. Jonah took another step. Not intrusive, not threatening, but close enough for the boundary to be drawn unmistakably. "You just insulted one of my employees," Jonah said, "and you'll have to apologize." The entire main street seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't because they were afraid of fighting. It was because everyone understood that what was happening didn't follow the old routine. No guns, no fists. Just one man standing still, asking for something Dusthaven rarely asked for: accountability for his words. The other man laughed, this time with a hint of tension. "Who do you think you are to give orders?" Jonah didn't answer immediately. He turned to look at the people standing around him, the shopkeeper, a few people from the pub, familiar faces, who had witnessed how Clara had been looked at since the beginning. "Nobody gave the order," Jonah said. "I just made it clear." He turned and looked directly at the other man. "You were wrong, and you will correct that." Clara stood beside Jonah. She didn't hold his hand. She didn't cling to him, but she stood there fully present. Not asking for protection, not avoiding his gaze. The man glanced around. Some people avoided his gaze. Some stared. No one laughed anymore. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dry. "For what?" Because he implied that a woman earning a living through labor was something else, Jonah said. "And because he did it in front of other people." "Just words," the other man muttered. Jonah nodded. "That's right. And that's why an apology only needs to be said." A long silence ensued. It wasn't violent, but it weighed heavier than any fight. Dusthaven was accustomed to resolving things by raising their voices, but now the town was forced to confront a different choice: maintain the old ways or accept a new boundary. Finally, the man bowed his head very slightly, not out of remorse, but out of the pressure of being seen. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I spoke too harshly." Jonah didn't smile. He didn't nod in triumph. He simply said, "Enough." Clara felt a strange sensation spreading through her body. Not exhilaration, not satisfaction. Rather, the peace of being placed back in her rightful place within the shared space. No one applauded. No one cheered. But one thing had changed, and Dusthaven knew it, though no one said it out loud. From that moment, a dividing line was drawn. It's not between Jonah Caldwell and the other man. It's between what's allowed to be said and what can no longer be ignored. Clara turned to Jonah. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Jonah shook his head. "I need to," he replied. "Not because of you, but because if I don't say it here, it will happen somewhere else." They left the main street in silence. No one stopped them. No one mocked them further. Dusthaven let them go this time, not out of indifference, but because the town had just been reminded that there were boundaries that could not be crossed without being called out. On the way back to Stone Ridge, Clara thought about that moment. Not the apology, but the way Jonah stood still, unwavering. No physical strength needed, just unshakable principles. "Aren't you afraid that will make things worse?" Clara asked. Jonah looked straight ahead. "Maybe," he said. "But there are things that only get worse when people pretend they don't exist." Clara nodded. She understood. She had lived her whole life in such silences. As Stone Ridge came into view, the afternoon sun stretched across the fields. Clara dismounted and took a deep breath. The air was the same, but she was no longer the same person. Today she is not only protected, she is recognized. And for someone who has been forced into silence for so long, that is more precious than any other form of protection. But when a public line is drawn, those who thrive on ambiguity rarely back down, and very soon the past will retaliate in the most dangerous way by staining honor with blood. Not all retaliation comes immediately after a challenge. There are those who wait, gather their strength, and strike at the very moment the other person begins to believe they are safe. Edward Lane was that kind of person. News reached Stone Ridge on a windy afternoon. Clara Hayes was gathering eggs when she saw a man on horseback stop at the gate. Not a stranger. It was a face belonging to Dusthaven, one of the people who had stood by and watched Jonah force the offending man to apologize. "Something's happened," the man said curtly. "In town." Clara knew immediately. No further questions were needed. Her intuition, the very thing that had helped her survive, suddenly became as taut as a violin string. "What's going on?" Jonah asked from behind the fence. The man swallowed hard. "Edward Lane. He accused you." Jonah's expression didn't change. Accusation of what killing? The atmosphere seemed to freeze. Clara felt her hands grow cold even though the wind wasn't that strong. She looked at Jonah, searching for a reaction: surprise, anger, denial. But Jonah just stood there for a long time, as if he knew this day would come. "Who are you going to kill?" Jonah asked. The man avoided Clara's gaze. "A man. Many years ago. In Montana. Edward said he killed someone and then fled." Clara shook her head reflexively. "That's impossible." Jonah turned to look at her. His gaze didn't avoid hers. But it wasn't reassuring either. It carried something heavier, the acceptance that the secret had finally been brought to light. "Deputy Sheriff Miller is gathering people," the man added. "They're coming up here." The man turned his horse and rode away, leaving Stone Ridge in a broken silence. Clara stepped closer to Jonah. "That's not true, is it?" she asked. Not as a question, but as someone unwilling to lose faith anymore. Jonah looked out at the field. The wind blew strongly, flattening the grass before it rose again. "Not all of it," he said. That answer hurt Clara more than a clumsy denial. The sound of horse hooves echoed shortly afterward. Deputy Sheriff Miller led two others. Not hurried, not angry, but serious in a way that made it clear this matter was beyond mere rumor. "Jonah Caldwell," Miller said, dismounting. "I need you to come with us." "Because of the accusation?" Jonah asked. "Because a murder case is still unsolved," Miller replied. Edward Lane provided the name, location, and time. Clara took a step forward. "Edward Lane is a liar," she said. "He deceived me. He hit me." Miller looked at her. "I know he's not trustworthy," he said. "But the law doesn't work on feelings." Jonah nodded. "I'll go." Clara turned to him, her voice trembling for the first time in a long time. "You can't just leave like that." Jonah looked at her for a long time. "If I don't go," he said, "they'll come another way." "He never told me," Clara said. "Never." Jonah took a deep breath. "I hope I won't have to say it." One of the two men accompanying Miller looked at Jonah with a wary expression. "Do you have a weapon?" "No," Jonah replied. "I didn't bring any." Miller gestured. But before they could move, another hoofbeat sounded from the road. Edward Lane appeared as if he had been waiting for this moment. He dismounted, his triumphant expression barely concealed. "I told you," he said. "Good people aren't always clean." Clara looked at him. Her heart pounded, but she was no longer afraid. Only a cold anger remained. "He has no right to be here," she said. Edward gave a wry smile. "I have my rules." Jonah turned to Edward. "What do you want?" he asked. Edward shrugged. "Justice. And maybe a little fairness for myself." "You want me to be silent," Jonah said. "You want to regain control." Edward took a step forward. "I want the truth." Jonah looked him straight in the eye. "The truth doesn't always side with the one who speaks louder." Edward smiled, but the smile didn't last. He looked at Clara. "Do you think you understand this man?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She turned to Jonah. "Did you kill someone?" she asked. The question came down heavy, direct. Jonah didn't evade the question. "Yes," he said. Everything seemed to fall apart at once. Edward laughed loudly. One of the two men accompanying Miller clenched his fist. Miller closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if he had anticipated this. "But that's not what Edward Lane said," Jonah continued. Edward snapped, "Murder is murder." Jonah took a step forward. Not to attack, just to stand straight before the accusation. "I'm not running away," he said. "I'm at Stone Ridge under my real name. I've never hidden myself." Edward blushed. "Then let the court decide." Clara felt the blood rush to her ears. "He's manipulating things," she said. "He wants revenge." Edward turned to her. "You're not involved." Jonah looked at Edward, his eyes suddenly turning cold. It was the first time Clara had seen that. "Don't talk to her like that." Edward sneered. "What are you going to do, beat me up?" Jonah didn't strike. But Edward was the one who made the first move. He pushed Jonah hard against his chest. That moment everything exploded. Jonah reacted, grabbing Edward's wrist and pushing him back. There was no fatal blow, no outburst of hostility, but Edward lost his balance and fell to the ground. He sprang up and lunged again, this time faster and more aggressively. A voice screamed. Clara recoiled, her heart pounding. Jonah parried the blow, pushing Edward away. He didn't attack again, but Edward lunged forward as if he needed a scene of violence to bolster his story. "That's enough," Miller shouted. But Edward didn't stop. He grabbed Jonah's shirt, and in that chaotic moment Jonah pushed hard, not to hurt but to end it. Edward fell again, rolling a few times on the ground. Blood trickled from his forehead, not much but enough to draw everyone's attention. "See!" Edward yelled. "The murderer," Miller gestured. The two men stepped forward and restrained Jonah. Jonah offered no resistance. He stood still, breathing slowly, as if he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Clara rushed forward. "Don't," she said. "He didn't do anything." Miller looked at her. "I have to do my work." Jonah turned to Clara. "Don't follow," he said softly. "Will he come back?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. Jonah looked at her. No promises, no reassurance. Just one sentence enough to keep him here for life. "Hold Stone Ridge." They handcuffed Jonah. Not roughly, but decisively. Edward stood up, wiped the blood, a brief glint of victory in his eyes. As Jonah was led away, Clara stood in the middle of the field, the wind howling, dust swirling everywhere. The man she trusted, the man who had never lied to her, had just been dragged away, branded a murderer. She didn't know what to believe. She didn't know how deep Jonah's past was. But she knew one thing for sure: Edward Lane wasn't telling the truth to seek justice, he was telling it to destroy. Stone Ridge became unusually quiet. Clara stood alone, clutching the broken comb in her pocket. She wasn't crying. Not yet. Because when things fall apart so quickly, people need time to understand what they're losing. And when the man whose name bears blood is no longer there to speak the truth, if it exists, will demand an even greater price to be spoken. Dusthaven's prison wasn't as cold as one might imagine. It wasn't damp nor excessively dark, but it had something more suffocating than the darkness, a prolonged, unending silence. Jonah Caldwell sat alone on a wooden bench, his hands resting on his knees. Not bound. Not being treated roughly. Deputy Miller had known him long enough to know that Jonah wasn't the type to try to escape. "Do you have anything to say?" Miller asked, his voice more tired than firm. Jonah looked up. The light from the high window shone down on his face, revealing wrinkles that had been there even before Clara Hayes came into his life. "Yes," Jonah said, "but not to defend myself." Miller sat down opposite her. He didn't open his notebook. He didn't pick up a pen. He had learned that there were confessions that shouldn't be immediately recorded in a document. "Edward Lane said he killed someone," Miller said. "He confirmed it." Jonah nodded. "I killed someone." There is no tragedy in the voice. No self-pity. Just the truth laid bare, naked and heavy. "Who did you kill?" Miller asked. Jonah closed his eyes for a very brief moment. Not to escape the memory, but to make sure he could name it correctly. "A man," Jonah said. "The one who ruined my wife." Miller didn't ask immediately. He left the question between them like a heavy object that needed to be lifted slowly. "What were the laws like back then?" Miller asked. Jonah gave a wry smile. "The law knows, and the law has chosen not to look." Jonah began to tell his story. No unnecessary details. No embellishment. No attempt to make the story heroic. He told it as someone who had carried the memory long enough to no longer be capable of lying about it. His wife, a gentlewoman living by the same faith that Clara Hayes once lived, had been ruined by a powerful man in the town. Not just physically, but honorably. When Jonah turned to the law, they listened. They took notes. And then they advised him to let things calm down. "There's no strong enough evidence," Jonah said. "Just the testimony of a woman." Miller bowed his head. He had heard that phrase too many times in his career. Jonah continued, not about anger, but about the prolonged helplessness. About watching the one he loved slowly fade away, not because of the wound, but because the world refused to acknowledge her pain. "I wasn't looking for him to kill him," Jonah said. "I was looking for him to force him to confront what he'd done." Miller looked up. "And what happened?" He laughed. Jonah replied, and he said the law was on his side. Jonah opened his eyes and looked straight at Miller. And at that moment I knew that if I turned my back, the evil would continue, not just against my wife. Jonah killed the man. Not in a fit of madness, not out of impulsive revenge, but because of a cold, conscious decision that he carried with him for the rest of his life. And then Miller asked. The law closed the case, Jonah said, because that guy had other enemies, because the town didn't want trouble, because the death was convenient. Miller sat in silence for a long time. He looked at Jonah not as a criminal but as someone who had taken on what society refused to bear. Edward Lane knows about this, Miller asked. Jonah nodded. He heard it, and he understands that this is the only thing that can be used to smear blood on my name. But the arrest warrant has been dropped, Miller said slowly. That is no longer in effect. Jonah nodded. I know, but the truth is still there. Miller stood up. He paced a few steps around the small cell as if contemplating something not found in the law books. You know, Miller said, turning around, if I had followed every line of the law correctly, I shouldn't be sitting here listening to this. Jonah didn't answer. But if I did that, Miller continued, I would have to pretend I didn't understand what had happened to his wife, and to so many other people. Outside, Dusthaven is still alive. The pub is still open. The shops are still doing business. But inside this small prison cell, a truth is forcing the system to look itself in the eye. Edward Lane wants him imprisoned, Miller said. Not for justice, but for control. Jonah nodded. I know. And Clara Hayes, Miller asked. Jonah was silent for a while longer. She doesn't deserve to carry my shadow. Miller looked at Jonah. Do you think she'll leave? Jonah shook his head very slowly. No, but I think she'll be in pain. Miller sighed. He stood up and opened the cell door. I'll review the files, he said, and I'll give you a full report. That would get him into trouble, Jonah said. Miller nodded. Maybe, but if I hadn't reported it, I would have been in trouble. When Jonah was led out, Clara Hayes was waiting in the hallway. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stood straight like someone prepared to hear the worst. Jonah stopped in front of her. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to cover up. I told the truth, he said. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. I know. Didn't she ask? Jonah asked softly. Clara shook her head. Not to judge, she said. Just to understand. And what does she understand? Jonah asked. Clara took a deep breath. I understand that you did something the law wouldn't dare to do, and you'll pay for it for the rest of your life. Jonah closed his eyes. If she leaves, I won't, Clara said, without hesitation. Not because I condone murder, but because I don't condone the world forcing him to stand alone when it happened. The news spread slowly, not loudly, not sensationally, but it was enough for Edward Lane to understand that his card had lost its effect. The old arrest warrant was officially dropped. No one declared Jonah innocent. But no one had the right to call him a fugitive anymore either. Stone Ridge welcomed them back in silence. No victory, no relief, only the continuation of life. Clara stood on the porch watching Jonah repair the fence. The man hadn't become any cleaner after the truth, but he had become more authentic. And for Clara Hayes, that was enough to make her stay. Because when the truth has been paid for at all costs, what remains is not the past, but a place where people choose to stand still and continue to live decent lives even with nothing left to prove. Stone Ridge entered autumn without warning. No milestones. No marked dates. Just one morning, Clara Hayes woke up and noticed the light had changed color. The sun was no longer harsh. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and cool earth. The familiar sounds chickens' old wood were still there, but softer, as if the whole farm were learning to breathe more slowly. Clara stood on the back porch wearing a light sweater, gazing at the vast field stretching before her. She no longer saw it as a temporary shelter, nor as a stopover out of necessity. Stone Ridge appeared before her as something rare in life, a place that didn't demand she become someone else. Jonah Caldwell was repairing the fence in the distance. He worked slowly and steadily as he always did. There was no sign of someone who had just been through a major storm. But Clara knew, not because Jonah wasn't affected, but because he was used to moving on after things that couldn't be erased. They didn't talk much about what had happened. Not because they were avoiding it, but because it wasn't necessary. The truth had been told. And after the truth was told, life didn't linger to contemplate it for too long. Life simply asked a simpler question: what will we do next? Clara can leave. The thought still returned occasionally, no longer as an urging but as an ever-open door. She could take what she had learned at Stone Ridge, self-respect, a slow pace of life, a sense of security, and start somewhere else. No one was holding her back. No one was forcing her to choose this place. But every time Clara thought about leaving, one thing became very clear: she no longer had a reason to run. One afternoon, as Clara was harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, Jonah approached. He stood there for a while, watching her work, not to judge, but to wait for the right moment to speak. "This winter could be long," Jonah said. "If you want to find a warmer place." Clara looked up, smiling faintly. "I'll stay." Jonah didn't ask why. He just nodded. At Stone Ridge, important decisions don't need to be dissected to prove their validity. Clara bent down to continue her work, but after a few strokes she stopped. "It's not because of love," she said, as if she needed to make it clear even though no one asked. "Not the impulsive kind." Jonah didn't react. He understood. "And it's not because I have nowhere else to go," Clara continued. "I stayed because this was the first place that told me the truth, and I genuinely intend to live by it." Jonah stood still. The wind blew, rustling the dry leaves at their feet. He looked at the field, then at Clara. "Stone Ridge doesn't promise much," he said. "It only promises to do what's right." Clara nodded. "That's enough." The following days passed without any dramatic events. No major occurrences. But it was during these days that Clara realized the most important thing: she no longer counted the days in anxiety. She wakes up early. She tends to the chickens. She gardens. She cooks. These seemingly small tasks are no longer a way to prove her worth. They are simply a part of the life she has chosen. Jonah maintained his boundaries. He didn't enter Clara's room. He didn't ask her where she was going when she went to the nearby small town. He didn't ask questions about the future that demanded immediate answers. But there were subtle changes if one paid close attention. An extra chair was placed on the front porch. A coat hook was repaired to make it more secure. An oil lamp was left in the kitchen for the evenings. It's not a romantic gesture. It's a lasting presence, something that doesn't need promises to exist. Clara began planting a small flower bed near the fence. Not for decoration, but because she wanted to. She chose a cold-tolerant variety, a subdued color, unpretentious, just like herself. When the first flowers bloomed, Jonah paused to look at them for longer than usual. "They'll survive the winter," he said. Clara smiled. "Me too." There were evenings when they sat by the fire in silence. Clara mended clothes. Jonah repaired farm tools. The firelight danced on the old wooden walls. There were no dramatic moments to recount, but if someone were to ask Clara when she knew she had made the right choice, she would say it was those moments when there was nothing special to remember, yet it felt enough. Stone Ridge gradually became more than just a farm. It was her home, a place where Clara knew where she would sleep tonight, and tomorrow, and next week. It was a place to rise up, a place where she wouldn't be judged by her past but by what she did each day. And most importantly, it was a place to maintain her dignity. Not by rules, but by how people treated each other when no one was watching. One early winter morning, a light snowfall fell. Clara stood at the window watching the first snowflakes touch the ground. She thought of Dusthaven. Not with resentment, not with fear, just a memory that had been placed in its proper place behind. Jonah walked over and stood beside her. "If you ever regret it," Clara shook her head. "No." She turned to him. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, "but I know I no longer have to prove that I deserve to stay." Jonah looked at her. Jonah. His eyes held no promise, only acknowledgement. They didn't talk about marriage. They didn't talk about big words. But one thing was forming slowly, surely, a companionship that needed no name. As night fell, Clara locked her bedroom door as usual, not out of fear but because habit had been respected. She lay down, listening to the wind outside, listening to Stone Ridge drift off to sleep. Clara Hayes understood that life hadn't given her an easy start, but ultimately it gave her something far more precious: the right to stay where she had chosen, without needing anyone's permission. And if someone were to ask why she stayed in Stone Ridge, she wouldn't talk about Jonah Caldwell. Not about the past. She would just say one simple sentence, true enough to carry with her for a lifetime: "This is the first place that told the truth and meant it." And in that border region, amidst the wind, the earth, and the wounded people, love doesn't appear like a miracle, but as the courage to continue living decently each day in the place we have chosen to be. From the story You're Coming With Me, the cowboy who took in a bruised mail order. Bride, the biggest lesson lies not in the dramatic events, but in the quiet choices people make when no one forces them to be good anymore. The story reminds us that dignity doesn't come from being loved, but from being treated with respect. Clara wasn't saved by promises, nor healed by pity. She was reborn when she found a place where she could work, where boundaries were respected, where she was called by her right name, and where she believed that her past wasn't a life sentence. In modern life, many of us have been like Clara, silent to survive, fleeing for fear of judgment, constantly questioning ourselves, am I worthy? This story answers that question for us. People don't need to be worthy to be treated kindly. Jonah represents an increasingly rare value, principled kindness. He is not perfect, not absolutely innocent, but he dares to stand with humanity when the system turns its back. This reminds us that living right isn't always safe, but it always has lasting value. Sometimes the best thing we can do isn't to save someone, but to avoid pushing them further away. And finally, Stone Ridge symbolizes something everyone needs in life, a place where the truth is spoken and where they truly live by that truth. It could be a home, a relationship, or simply a choice to live each day. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If the story resonated with you in some quiet way, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling slow, deep, and kind stories like this. Your companionship is what keeps these heartwarming stories being told.